Hello there. Today's episode of Beyond Distribution with GTDC features our guest, Larry Walsh, who is the CEO and Chief Analyst at Channelnomics. Channelnomics focuses on improving the performance of tech companies through business intelligence and enablement services. Larry shares his thoughts on the current macroeconomic trends affecting key geographies and talks about the recently published Channel Recession Guide, which outlines how vendors can defray and defer fixed costs while maintaining go-to-market capacity by engaging with distribution. The guide is available on our website, www.gtdc.org. Enjoy the episode.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the GTDC podcast, Beyond Distribution. I'm thrilled today to have with us Larry Walsh, who's the CEO and Chief Analyst for Channelnomics. Larry, good afternoon. Good to have you.
Hey, Frank, great to be here.
Yeah. So, Larry, I know you're, very well known in the industry, and a lot of people, a lot of vendors certainly know who you are. You've been in the space a long time, but if you don't mind, just spend a minute, if you would, and kind of give everybody an overview of maybe you and Channelnomics.
Oh, thanks. I hate it when it's beginning to bother me now that people say a long time. Frank, you and I've known each other for nearly 20 years. It's beginning the numbers are beginning to creep up. But yeah, Channelnomics, we are a channel strategy and research firm. We support I don't know how many companies around the world in developing routes to market and quantitative and qualitative understandings about what's happening in the channel and in the broader industry at large. So our job is to provide guidance and evidence for making channels work better.
Well, that's great. And by the way, get used to it because it only gets worse.
I understand.
I can promise you that.
Yeah.
Well, good. So obviously, you mentioned you work for a lot of, you consult for a lot of vendors. You certainly have worked with us a little bit, and you're very well entrenched in the space. So if you would, let's talk a little bit about the environment, sort of the macro environment right now,
Right.
and what you're seeing out there in terms of the economy, both maybe domestically and globally, because I know you're doing a lot of business, certainly in Europe.
Yeah, no, we do. And this is kind of something we fell into. It wasn't part of our repertoire until this year to actually track macroeconomics. And we monitor a number, I will not say the Channelnomics is not an economics think tank. We take information from the real experts on this, and we contextualize it for the channel. And we were asked to do this just this year because of it started with the war in Ukraine, because that had an immediate impact on regional and global economies, and if they would actually look like it was going to have a much broader impact than it has. There's a lot going on out there, Frank. The Europe's inflation rate is above 10%, and it's not going to come down. It's going to go up. Manufacturing is declining in Europe already because they're beginning to conserve fuel, particularly natural gas going into winter. Fuel prices are going to increase. That's going to exacerbate food prices as well. So we know that Europe is going to have a pretty severe recession in 2023. China just the other day, China reported its GDP numbers. They're saying that they're around 3.5, 3.6% growth. China, what the experts say is that China typically overstates their growth by 3 to 5%. So China's probably in a recession. The U.S., despite the high inflation rates, so the inflation right now in the U.S. is ranging between 8 and 10%, where the Federal Reserve nominally wants it around 2.5%. It's still, the U.S. is in really good shape, economically speaking. Now, are we going to have a recession here? Probably. Is it going to be as severe as Europe or in what we're expecting to see in parts of Asia? No, we're not. The U.S. has blessed with good energy supplies, strong food supplies, and in fact, the U.S. is repatriating manufacturing capacity. So far this year, manufacturing capacity in the U.S. is up 116%. So there's a lot of things, the U.S., Canada, Mexico, we're going to feel this, but it's not going to be as severe as in a broader spectrum, that what they're saying is that it's not going to be as severe as what you're going to see in other parts of the world.
Yeah, well, you're certainly right about it being an interesting time. I mean, it's
To say the
again,
least.
huh? Yeah, to say the
To say
least.
the least, yeah.
When we go back, as you mentioned, both a long way, and been through certainly the '08 situation, and some before them, and some after that, and there's a lot happening. One of the things that we experienced, we had our event, I think back in June in Europe, and we had somebody from the BBC talk, and he was quite negative about what he anticipated, and exactly what you talked about. And the sense is it's actually getting worse instead of better. Now, new prime minister, obviously, as of a couple of days ago, so that's interesting, and perhaps there's some optimism around that. But I do think it's going to be a tough sledding for everybody.
Well, Frank, you mentioned the recession of 2008. Let's go back a little bit further than that. Is that they say inflation is at historic highs or 40-year highs. There's a reason why they say that, because if they went back further than 40 years, then they'd see double-digit inflation rates. Because if you go back to the 70s, and the first recession I remember, which was 78, 79, 80, inflation rates were ranging between 16 and 19%. So we are nowhere near the type of economy that we were in the 70s, which, that's why I say it's that we have a long ways to go before we start really hitting the floor.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. But, with that said, though, obviously, in the world that we live in, there'll be impacts. And, one of the things that, I know you recently published was a channel recession survival guide, which I
Yeah.
thought was, a really good document and a good piece of work. Why don't you highlight some of what you covered in there and some of the advice that you've put out there for a lot of the, again, the channel members across all, elements, whether it's, solution providers, vendors, or distributors.
Yeah. Well, we're working on the guide for solution providers now. We put that together because we saw what was coming. And even though, as I said, North America, we're probably going to have the sniffles to other country. Europe will have the flu. China's going to just continue to have COVID. Um, but the reason why we put the guide together is because we know that there's going to be a lot of retraction. In fact, we've been seeing it now, even though it's like I mentioned, the unemployment rate here, at least in the US, is still, we're relatively at full employment. And unemployment remains around 3.8%. And that's the same in other parts of the world too. Western Europe is also really well employed. And it's an anomaly under these circumstances, but we're seeing tech companies already over in September and October. We've seen tech companies start doing some layoffs. They've been saying under reorganization. We know that there's a wave of layoffs coming out of Silicon Valley and out of the tech industry in November and December going into the new year. Every one of the vendors that we work with has told us that they're making some significant cuts, not just in staffing, but also in budgets. And that's what prompted us to put that guide together, is to say, look, the 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 normal reaction like this is to bring things closer to you, is to try to maintain as much control and not worry as much about what's or lean or rely on things that are outside your direct control. That means bringing more stuff in the house. And we said, don't skimp on the channel. And that's what this guide is about. Our survival guide says, lean on the channel, leverage the channel as a resource, continue to invest in channel, invest in partners across the board, because by definition, the channel is a means of defraying cost. You're deferring cost in favor of action. And everything that happens in the channel is based on meritocracy. The partners only get paid when they do something. If they're not doing anything for you, then they're not costing you anything. So that's why we say the guide goes through the steps and the considerations of what partners can do on the vendor's behalf to help them augment, maintain, and even thrive when budgets and staffing are being cut.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting, Larry, because despite what we clearly know is happening and either going to happen or beginning to happen, there's still a lot of optimism out there. When I talk to solution providers, and a lot of it perhaps has to do with the fact that technology solves a lot of evil, right? And that it's really required, and it's changing so dramatically, and the productivity gains that people are seeing are so dramatic that it's compelling. But what I'm hearing is that the solution providers are telling us that business is still strong and there's still a lot of opportunity out there. Are you hearing the same thing? What's your sense?
Um, we know that the inflation rate is having an impact on their operations, that it is causing their costs to go up, and the solution providers are not able to pass costs on as easily as vendors are. In fact, a lot of the managed service providers that we talk with, they tell us about the way that they describe to us the way that they build their pricing models, that they're baking in a fairly healthy margin over the course of a year or 2 year contract with a customer, knowing that that margin is going to erode because they're either going to see price increases from their vendors or they're going to add new functionality or new capability into their stack that they can't just go and increase the price on because again they lock in early on. Inflation is causing wages to go up, so that's causing a problem for a lot of solution providers. But we're now beginning to see signs that it's also inflation and the concerns about the economy are beginning to impact sales. We just did a piece of research and report with Axiom, which is a provider of managed backup service, business continuity and disaster recovery services. And a lot of the MSPs that we surveyed for that, they're telling us that they're feeling the headwinds already. So we know that the weather is changing. We again we don't know what it's going to look like, and I agree with you. I mean, just as of this recording this week, we saw Microsoft and Google do their earnings announcements, and Microsoft beat their number, which will make some people think that services in the cloud are recession proof, but they're not. And that's going to cause there's going to be once things really start to slow down, then we're going to start to see everybody's going to start pinching on where their IT investments are. There is another key number out there which is really telling as well, is that the US, this is just a US number, US retail is sitting on a huge inventory going into the holidays. So it's somewhere north, I think the Wall Street Journal said it was somewhere north of $780 billion in inventory. And what's happened is that if we had all these supply chain disruptions, we couldn't get any product onto the shelves everywhere. And it wasn't just B2B. I know a lot of the people, listening in on this, were dealing with back orders on, particularly on hardware products. That's pretty much over. There's still some component shortages out there, but a lot, particularly in consumer goods and retail, that's over. And now all that inventory has hit the shelves right when the consumers are shifting their spending from discretionary to necessity, meaning that they're not buying things that they want, they're buying things that they need, like food. And that's going to have a real impact on the holiday sales season, which will then trickle into our Q1.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's an interesting data point. I know that I know that in the IT space, because of the work that we do with IDC and Context in terms of
Mm.
gathering the sales out data, that we're starting to see some inventory build up, particularly in the low end of the market. The PC and the peripherals and the monitor space. The sort of enterprise space, from what we've seen and heard, remains robust, and they're still working off pretty significant backlogs, but the backlogs are dissipating very, very quickly on the PC side, and we've seen that. Although what we are also seeing is it's shifting from sort of low ASPs to higher end, higher ASPs in the commercial space, which I think is a lot of companies investing in work from home devices for people, which require more security, more, just a more robust system. So
Yeah.
a little bit of a mixed bag.
Well, one of the things that did happen over the past 18 months with the supply chain disruptions, particularly when it comes to semiconductors and components, the fabs that were making all the semiconductors figured out that we were going to spend money on whatever it took to remain operational. So you needed web cameras, you needed headsets, you needed PCs, you needed monitors. All these things need semiconductors. And what they did was is that they stopped building the low end components and only pushed towards high end. So a lot of the spending that you're describing is not necessarily a result of choice as much as a result of necessity. That's what's available. That's what got built. And because again, the supply side figured out that the buy side would spend money. And this is also causing some companies, and there's a pricing analyst that we follow, just released a note on this to his subscribers saying, raise your prices because you can, not because you need to. If you're not feeling any inflation pressure, don't sit back, raise your prices now because you're not going to be able to raise your prices later as easily. And it's kind of cynical to me. I understand the logic behind it, but it's cynical. But you're seeing the same thing play out across the board. You can look at a number of companies that consumer goods, Procter and Gamble just reported their unit sales are down, their revenues are up. Why? Because they increased their prices.
Yeah, I mean, I bought a car recently and went through it. I mean, it was sticker plus,
Yep.
and there was no debate. It was here's the price. It was one of the easiest, most unsatisfying buying scenarios I've ever been through.
I went through the same thing last year.
Yeah.
Same thing last year. Not only that, but I bought a new car this time last year. Not only did I pay sticker on it, I paid sticker for a year-old car that was left on the lot that didn't have all the components installed.
Luckily, I didn't need one that time, but I needed one recently, and I was pretty frustrated.
Yep.
But I told the salesman, I've known for a while. I said, look, I get it. I know what you guys are doing, but I won't forget this. So when the time comes and the pendulum shifts back to us being able to negotiate again, I'm going to remember this because it was annoying. But anyway, we digress, and it's kind of a perfect storm, as you mentioned, as it relates to the supply chain piece, because obviously back a year and a half ago, maybe almost two, we had the reverse with the chip manufacturing process, and what happened there, and how they immediately cut back based on what they thought was going to happen with the macro environment, and the reverse happened, and demand spiked, and we got caught in that shortage, and now we're going to get caught. You would think after all of this machinations that we could figure this stuff out.
You'd like to say so. And Frank, you mentioned your GTDC's relationship with IDC and Context. I mean, two great organizations when it comes to this stuff. One of the things that we talk about it frequently, and I talk about it with our clients as well. For an industry that its value proposition is on the generation and management of data, our industry is terrible at organizing and leveraging data for this type of real decision making. I'm not saying it's not unheard of. I mean, there's some great companies out there that are use true quantitative analytics to really drive their businesses. You've worked for a couple of them that that truly are masters at it. But even they struggle with maintaining getting and using data effectively, and it's a real problem for the industry.
Yeah, you would think it's a great opportunity for AI or big data manipulation to be able to figure this out, because if what you described happens, and I think you've used some really good data points to point to what potentially will happen, like the retail inventory, et cetera. It'll be painful. It'll be painful.
Yeah.
So,
Unfortunately, Frank, 158% of statistics are made up.
yeah, well, who's going to argue with you, right? So, Larry, let's move over to obviously distribution, which is
Right.
obviously near and dear to my heart, and also to yours, because you've written, you've been on the record, you've been advising companies, you've been consulting with companies for quite a long time, and frankly have been very bullish about the role distributors play in the overall ecosystem, and as importantly, how vendors and other members of the ecosystem should be thinking about distributors and how they should be using distributors, and that's been really good information and really good data coming from a neutral source, if you will, right?
Yeah.
So talk a little bit about that, because you also recently wrote a guide for us, which we're in the process of publishing, called Distribution as a Recession Countermeasure. And
Yep.
essentially, it's a guide talking to the marketplace on the things that you could use distributors for and how distributors can help. So, if you will, talk a little bit about that, because I think that was a really good document.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the genesis of that was the recession survival guide that we published over the summer. And for everyone, we do collaborate with GTDC on a number of things. And Frank and I were talking. It's like, it would be good to have a guide like this for distribution, to help the vendors understand more specifically, what distributors can do. Let me back up even a little further than that, though. Part of the reason why, Frank, I'm bullish on distribution and I advocate on its behalf, not blindly. I mean, there are things that I will, when I work with different companies and say, it's okay, if you don't need distribution, let's not force it in here. There are instances where that is the case. But there's a lot of unfounded skepticism about the value and role distribution can play in go-to-market strategies and go-to-market models. In fact, a number of companies that we work with openly question what distribution is doing for them. They come to us looking for guidance. How do we get out of distribution? How do we lessen our dependence? How do we pull it back? And part of it is because they see they apply reductive reasoning to it. What's distribution really doing for us? Well, it's just credit and collections. It's doing financing. We don't need that in cloud. We don't need that in services. Um, and what they find is that distribution actually plays a really valuable role. Now, let's fast forward to using distribution as a recession countermeasure. There's a number of things distributors can do, just as we described for vendors, that they can lean into their reseller population to extend their capacity, make sure that they're maintaining their contact with the market, and they're still generating revenue. We say the same thing for distribution. Distribution can provide sales support. They can provide training. They can provide marketing resources. They can provide analytics. Distributors are increasingly becoming the fulfillment mechanism for online sales being done by partners. So there's a lot of things that distributors can do, particularly in an economic downturn. And that's what we point to in this guide, that if you as a vendor have to cut your fixed cost, and that really is the enemy here. When revenues go down, the economy's hit and battering you, fixed costs kill you. So if you need to remove your fixed cost and you have to go into something that's more variable, well, first, defer some of these functions, management functions, go-to-market functions, support functions, to distribution. Let them manage, not just let them manage the channel or pieces of the channel, and help get work with them on how do they grow and how do they influence partners to continue to work the market to generate revenue and bring it back upstream.
I think, Larry, well, first of all, your point is well taken. And I've had this discussion, God knows how many times over the years, even when I was on the vendor side, is that the distributors are way more than a bank and a warehouse. And that has clearly evolved over time. And if anything, the pandemic just underscored how important they were in keeping the overall global supply chain moving, and reacting the way they needed to react. The thing that's interesting to your point, and I'm sure you deal with this all the time with some of your clients is when you look initially at the cost of doing business with distributors, you could argue that it does add cost on the front end. But unless you do a complete analysis, which I know you and I have talked about before, and we're actually working together on a guide to help folks on this, unless you do a complete analysis that includes cost avoidance or cost deterrence, if you will, you're not seeing the real picture.
Right.
And it's complicated to do that because every company's in a little different space. Clearly, emerging vendors are in a much different place than the legacy vendors that have been doing business for a long time. The second part is it's sometimes hard to separate cost and really do a true cost accounting kind of an approach because there's a lot of embedded costs in various places that it's hard to pull out. But at the end of the day, I think it's from what you and I have kind of talked about, what we've looked at and what the data would suggest, there really is a ton of value in even despite some of the transition to cloud, some of the transition to, online platforms, distributors are now cranking up services in those spaces. And I know that, you're pretty well versed. Talk to me a little bit about what you see there and what you think the future is in terms of the services distributors are starting to provide and what they're going to provide kind of going forward.
Right. So first, I agree with you. There's part of the reason why distribution gets a bad rep is because it is seen as a cost plus on already perceived overtaxed sales model. All right, so you pay the partner their base discounts, or you're paying them on some back end incentive. You're going through as much as 80% of all channel sales go through non-standard pricing, so that brings down the through channel ASP even further. And then you get, once you get to the strike price with the partner, then you still have to pay the VIG to distribution. And yeah, I'm completely sympathetic to that math. What we talk about is substitution. So if you did not have distribution in the mix, what would it cost you to replace it? And this is what a lot of companies, you're right, it's not a line item you can just easily tease out. You actually have to go hunting for it. But it's a real cost, it's a human cost, systems cost, processing costs, even just the cost of maintaining history on sales is more than many vendors can handle. In fact, I was talking with one company that was telling me that they can't get out of distribution because they can't process an order. They don't have the physical being a strong word, but they don't have a system to where they could actually ingest an order and ingest payment from a partner. So it's pretty telling what happens, and you get really quick on this. Um, in terms of services, like distribution is going to continue to evolve. They are investing heavily in their capabilities, and not just their capabilities in terms of facilitating cloud services, but also in areas like ESG for environmental and sustainability. Just before getting on here, I was talking with the folks at D&H, and they're telling me about this really great case study they have about where they were able to ship 6,000 PCs to a school district with it, but they removed all the packaging so that they didn't have to deal with that. I mean, these are things distribution can have a real impact on. But I think the real thing is going to be, the real impact is going to come from two places. One is distribution will continue to be an influencer on vendor and product consideration. There's a huge amount of, I mean, distributors are sales engines. They have great amount of sales capacity. The second thing is that they are going to become the bench, the professional services bench of the industry, and this is something that Ingram and Tech Data before the merger, and even Cynics before the merger, they were doing some great stuff on this. But a lot of the distributors around the world, because we talk and touch distributors in all parts of the world, they're all talking about value add. And that's one of the things is that I still have vendors talk to me about the difference between a value add distributor and a broadline distributor. And I just sort of like, no, they're distributors. There's no difference between them anymore. You know, so yes, I will say to you is that there can be differences in the quality, in the value of the services that are being delivered. So that is variable. But the level of professional services and automated support that distributors are bringing to market is just astounding.
Yeah, totally. And what you described is right on in terms of the ability to transact business, and then the ability to help support the solution providers and certainly the vendors by definition, in terms of providing resources and services. The other thing that's coming that I think is going to be the next sort of evolution of this is being able to utilize through their platforms, AI techniques, big data techniques to help drive demand generation, right?
Yep.
Because who has more data, more history than anybody in the industry as to what's been shipped and what's been installed over the past, I don't know, 15, 20 years? It's the distributors.
Yep.
They have all of this information, and all of it is powerful in terms of being able to harvest it and be able to help a solution provider figure out, this customer is due for a refresh because the last time they purchased whatever was 4 years ago or 5 years ago, and it clearly needs to be enhanced for the following reasons. Distributors can now start to do that and will be starting to do that. And that will be the next phase, because it then goes beyond, helping folks do business. It's helping folks create business, which I think is really important.
Well, I think that what gets missed in the market is we talk a lot about solution selling, and we used to call it consultative selling, being able to satisfy the customer. There are very few vendors. I would argue there are none, but there are very few vendors that can solve the customer's problem alone. They need something else to do it. The solution provider, the reseller, or the service provider is a means of collecting these different brands, these different products, and putting them together. Distribution is a huge influencer on that process and be able to help that partner identify what a need is, identify what the right solution is, the right capacity, the right performance, the right price point, plugging it into a reference architecture and pushing it down to the customer. But even beyond that, a lot of stuff gets sold to the end customers incomplete, or they could be better if they had something else. And that's what distribution has. They have that visibility across a spectrum of different partners that are selling into the same customer, because customers will buy from multiple partners. To be able to identify what white space is available within an existing customer, that is really good intelligence, because it's far easier to sell to an existing customer than it is to try to cultivate a new one.
Totally. And so a lot of that, a lot of what we've talked about, and certainly a lot of the key points are included in the distribution as a recession countermeasure document that we've now released. So I think it'll be very valuable in the market. It would be valuable anytime, but certainly in what we're about to go through, or what we are seemingly starting to get into, it becomes even more valuable.
Yeah. And here's the thing, and Frank, I'm glad you said that, because if anyone reads this or is listening to this and saying, well, okay, that's what distribution does, I'm like, you're right. That's why we wrote it, because too many people are looking past the endemic value of that distributors bring to the table. And here we are, we're going to come into a time where things are going to get really tight. There's going to be a lot of questioning, a lot of hand wringing about what are you supposed to do? Well, look, it's sitting right in front of you. It's always been there, and it's a ready resource. Distribution is good for you when times are bad. Distribution is good for you when times are good.
Well, yeah, totally. And you even, and I know we're probably about to wrap up here, but the other comment I would make is, even in even in, whether it's good times or bad, one of the basics, the tenets of distribution has been their ability to provide, financial support. You don't know how many solution providers I run into and I've talked to over the years who told me if it wasn't for their distributor, they couldn't have done a deal, a number of deals, or run their business.
Yep.
And in times like potentially, recessions, like, certainly in the 2008, 2009, I remember it well, the distributors were able to be that backbone from a financing standpoint that sometimes gets totally, totally overlooked because it's such a basic part of what's done. It's not interesting, it's not sexy, but you know what? Take it away and see what would happen.
Yep, it's exactly right. And that's
Yeah.
the thing is that there needs to be more attention to we at Channelnomics, and we talk about this, is that there is not a channel. There is a value chain that starts from the supply side to the end user side or the buy side. And there has to be more end-to-end transparency in thinking around what it is that you're trying to accomplish and what are the right resources, the tools to get applied in order to operate in that chain effectively and get the most return out of it. And I believe in many cases, distribution really is an essential component of that go-to-market.
Yeah. Well, look, Larry, that's great. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking to us and our audience today. And I certainly appreciate all the work that we've done together. For those of you that are listening, the guide that we've referred to is available on the GTDC website, which is gtdc.org, and it's in our Knowledge Hub. And certainly, Larry, they know how to get a hold of you and Channelnomics, I'm sure.
Please, and look, and this is the one thing I would say, Frank, in closing this out, is that if anyone, and we offer this up through GTDC, is that if anyone wants clarifications, they want to talk about this, they would like to get some deeper insights, the Channelnomics team is available to you.
Yeah, that's great, Larry. Well, thanks. And I know we'll be doing more together as we go along. So appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Frank.